I'm Karen Elam, Director of the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. Thank you so much for joining us. With tonight being the fourth night of Hanukkah, I want to begin this evening with a brief introduction to the holiday. Hanukkah, a word that means dedication, celebrates the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem after a ragtag group of rebel Jews known as the Maccabees were able to take back their place of sacred worship after it was defiled by the Syrian Greeks in 164 BCE. At its core, the holiday is a celebration of the small over the mighty, of liberation from oppression, a theme that is particularly poignant in our time. Today, the observance of Hanukkah has assumed a visible community aspect as Jews proudly gather for public menorah lighting celebrations. At a time when being openly identifiable as Jewish can carry risks, these displays take on an increasingly defiant tone. So while those of us who observe the holiday enjoy lighting our Hanukkahs in our home each night and eating oily foods like latkes and donuts to commemorate the miracle of the sacred temple oil lasting 8 days when it should have lasted only 1, ever present in the backs of our minds are the sacrifices our ancestors made to practice their faith and the bravery that our outwardly recognizable brethren display simply by going about their day. If you'd like to learn more about Hanukkah, Jews, anti-Semitism, and more, consider signing up for the Jewish Federation's Shine a Light on Anti-Semitism campaign, taking place during the 8 days of Hanukkah. You can do so by going to the website jewishrochester.org. Tonight, our speaker, Oren Jacobson, will talk about the troubling tenacity of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hate. Oren is a civic entrepreneur, thought leader, and policy advisor focused on helping communities and organizations build the strength and capacity necessary to address systemic problems. His civic advocacy spans local to international engagement, and in his capacity as the co-founder of Project Shema, he has advised global Jewish institutions and supported global corporations as a subject matter expert on anti-Semitism. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Chicago, a master's in economics and policy analysis from DePaul University, and an MBA from Regis University. We'll have an opportunity at the end of Oren's presentation for Q&A, so please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Oren Jacobson.
Hi, Karen, and hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Karen, for the invitation. It's nice to be with you all, to the Jewish community tuning in. Chag Rim Sameach. I hope that you are enjoying the holiday. Before we get started in this presentation, I want to sort of touch on two things. The first is that this is really a focus on what it means to be a Jew, what anti-Semitism is, our history and our story, how anti-Semitism works. So for those who may not identify as part of the Jewish community, I want to say that nothing here is intended to be a comparison to from Jewish life to any other community, but rather an education and an insight into our communal experience. I also want to say that very frequently when Jews in America in particular bring up anti-Semitism, concerns around bigotry targeting our community, oftentimes non-Jewish folks that we know interject Israel and Palestine into the conversation. And I think it's really critical to say that no Jew should have the obligation of addressing the conflict in exchange for or as a price to talk about anti-Semitism. But at the same time, I don't think we can have an honest conversation about anti-Semitism and ignore those questions either. And so while most of this is not going to center on questions surrounding Israel, more broadly about anti-Semitism and Jewish history, we will touch on that. And the goal, again, is just to help people better understand our community's perspective, not to dismiss or deny the concerns of the Palestinian people. Now, as we start this conversation, I need to sort of say beyond the scope of my bio that Karen shared, that I'm the descendant of one of the 10% of Polish Jews to survive World War II. My grandfather is from a town called Lublin, Poland. Some of you may be familiar with it. And his hometown had 40,000 Jews before World War II. Now, I'm from Chicago. I'm coming to you live from just outside of Chicago, and I'm going to use a sports analogy to sort of explain what 40,000 people looks like. Some of you may be familiar with Wrigley Field, right, where the Cubs play baseball. That stadium can hold 40,000 people. So if you imagine a sports arena or your favorite amphitheater, and think about what it's like to be in that venue with 40,000 other people screaming and yelling and sort of what that environment is like. And then try to imagine that same venue, the emptiness and the silence of that venue with 300 people in that venue. My grandfather is one of the 300 from his town of 40,000 to survive World War II, which means that my life itself is a statistical improbability. If we lined 10 people up on stage today, 9 of those people would have been murdered by the Nazis, and I am the descendant of the one. So for me, my concerns and focus and investment into anti-Semitism as one of many things that I care deeply about as a Jew in America is built on the notion and on the understanding of what can happen when anti-Semitism spreads inside a country. And so with that, I'm going to pull up on screen a presentation designed to help all of us better understand the world's oldest hate, which unfortunately is a thing which is very poorly understood, even in some cases inside of our community, but especially outside of our community. And so the unfortunate reality is that we gather here today under the rising tide of anti-Semitism once more, and we see it rising across the globe. The reality is that anti-Semitism has known no geographic boundaries, no time limitations, and has never been exclusive to a single movement or community. It has presented itself in all eras, on all continents, and inside of all communities and political movements, and unfortunately, it is once again on the rise. Now, I think it's really important to name something about anti-Semitism, which is that while it most directly impacts the Jewish community, it also impacts all other communities, and it impacts the entire country that we would call home because it's based on conspiracy theories itself. And so when conspiracy theories spread, facts and truth ultimately get undermined. And when facts and truth get undermined, democracy and civil rights, which are fundamental to protecting individual liberty for all of us, get eroded. And when democracy and civil rights are threatened, it means that all communities have a stake. And by the way, in most of the situations where you've seen extreme anti-Semitism rise in a society, while Jews have been the main target, other communities have been targeted as well, which is to say that for all of us, in particular for those who aren't part of the Jewish community, this is a non-Jewish problem that impacts all of us directly. And I'm grateful that all of you are spending some time here tonight to get a little bit more acquainted with the world's oldest hate. So it may seem strange to start a conversation on anti-Semitism by asking or talking about who is the Jew. But the reality is that most people don't understand who the Jews are, what is a Jew, and therefore, as we will discuss, oftentimes and typically most people misdefine what it means, what anti-Semitism means. And so you really have to start an exploration of anti-Semitism with a simple question: who is the Jew? Now, in the American context in particular, most people think of Jews as a white religious community. And this is understandable on some levels, right? We have a shared religion, Judaism. Some of us are incredibly devout and Orthodox Jews. Some of us are incredibly secular, but all of us are part of a broader Jewish community. And so when people sort of frame what it means to be a Jew through the lens of being white and a religious community, it actually ends up doing two really important and problematic things. Number one, It erases the diversity of our community, which I'll explore in a little bit. Granted, in America, about 80 to 85% of us are white presenting, and 15 to 20% would identify as Jews of color. But when you get outside of America, that number is far different. And it also erases the thing that people hate about us, which is ultimately that we are Jews. And as we will come to explore, the color of our skin has never actually been determinative of the long-term security and safety of Jews in a given society. The reality is that who and what we are is a far more complex picture. Yes, as I mentioned, we have a shared religion that some of us are more connected to and others are less connected to. As a rule of thumb, I do not tell any Jew how to identify, and many Jews have a stronger identity tied to religion than other aspects. I also think beyond that it is not the job of anybody outside of our community to tell anybody inside of our community or our collective community how we should identify. We have a shared culture and a shared history, a shared language, and yes, our community absolutely thinks of itself through the language of being a people and or a nation, and that is not a modern phenomenon. That is a reality that is thousands of years in the making, that Jews have thought about ourselves as more than simply a religious community. And that is so critical as we start the conversation of understanding what anti-Semitism is, because if you think that Jews are just a religious community, you will automatically begin to think that anti-Semitism is just a religious bigotry. So as we think about Jewish history, and in particular modern Jewish history, we really need to start at the year 70 CE. Now, it might seem odd to think about 70 CE, nearly 2,000 years ago, as modern, but keep in mind the Jewish calendar is at 57, I think 81 or 82. My memory is a little bit shaky right now on this specific year, but almost 5,800 years old. So 2,000 years is relatively new in that context. But during this time period, at this time, Jews who have lived historically for millennia continuously in sort of the biblical land of Israel were largely and violently driven out and expelled from this territory by the Romans in what we would today call an act of colonization. An expulsion is sort of a whitewashed way of saying mass murder and the forcible removal of most of our community. Unfortunately, this expulsion is not a unique event in Jewish history, but this is the event which essentially sets the course for the next 2,000 years, which pulls the Jews, or pushes the Jews, I should say, into a largely diasporic community, meaning living in the diaspora, the vast majority of us not living in this piece of the world because of this violent expulsion. But this violent expulsion was by no means the exception to the rule. In fact, in many ways, it has been the rule of Jewish existence ever since, that the Jew has always been the mistrusted and attacked outsider, no matter where we have gone. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. But as you can clearly see from this map, which covers just a short period of time, where Jews go, where we seek refuge, we are frequently driven out of and expelled. Again, expulsion being an act of violence and mass murder and the forcible removal of entire Jewish communities from where we tried to settle once we were driven out of our ancestral and indigenous homeland. Now, what that sets off is a global search for safety. And the reason the Jewish community looks the way that it does is a response to that violence. And what I mean by that is that as Jews seek safety, we settle or resettle or migrate in these other parts of the world. Our diversity, our ethnic and racial diversity, is a byproduct of a response to that violence, more so than anything else. From the religious aspect of Judaism, we are a religion that does not do a lot of evangelizing. In fact, we make it very, very difficult for people to convert. So it's really important to understand that this is what the Jewish world looks like. It is people who look like me and people who look like the folks on the screen. And that the major reason why we are as ethnically and racially and geographically diverse is a byproduct of a global search for safety. that brings us to this question of what is anti-Semitism, because certainly it must be behind that story, the constant driving out and the violence targeting Jews. So most people think that modern anti-Semitism is about religion, when in fact modern anti-Semitism is really about people. We are ultimately attacked for being Jews and accused of various conspiracies, blamed and scapegoated for the ills of a society. It's important to think about this as primarily in the modern context. When I'm saying modern, I mean several hundred years at this point in time, as anti-Jew rather than anti-Judaism. And I understand why that can be confusing. It can be confusing in large part because if you think about an Orthodox Jewish man being stabbed and murdered on the streets of New York, the way this story is going to get reported is going to highlight his Orthodox Judaism, which is tied to a religious symbol. Or when you think about the Tree of Life shooting, a massacre of Jews in a synagogue, it is tied to a religious symbol. But if you read the manifesto of the shooter from the Tree of Life, the synagogue was nothing more than a container to find Jews who he blamed for undermining the white race in America by working to resettle refugees from Central and South America. The same is true of the Orthodox man. He is easily identifiable as a Jew. The issue is not with his devotion to the Torah. Even the word anti-Semitism itself is a racialized word. It was actually founded and coined by the Germans. And the reason they came up with this word, anti-Semitic, anti-Semitism, was this. In the pursuit of their pseudo-racial science, the desire to prove that white people, the Aryan race, were superior and all other races were inferior, which, by the way, obviously includes Jews, who they believed were uniquely evil and responsible for the ills of the world, they had a problem. And the problem is that Ashkenazi Jews, Jews who look like me, are walking around their country too, presenting as white, and even worse in some cases as blonde-haired and blue-eyed white-presenting Jews. And if you need to distinguish the Jew from the pure-blooded white Aryan, you need a racialized construct, and that is how the word anti-Semitic actually even became coined. The word itself was coined by Jew haters as a way to define Jews as an explicitly inferior and subversive race. Now, the next question to think about as we pivot from what is anti-Semitism and thinking about that construct as targeting Jews as people in its modern context, blaming Jews as people for the ills of society, accusing us of undermining or being responsible for a whole manner of things. As we shift to the question of how does anti-Semitism actually work? As we think about the American context, and we think in particular about the idea of systemic oppression or bigotry, we think a lot about race as the construct through which we explore these questions. And in the story of America over 400 years, white has been on top, black has been on the bottom. And while it is better to be black in America today than at any point up until this point, it is hard to conceive of a world in which this could flip, in which whites might be on the bottom and systemically attacked. Not that anybody is actually advocating for that, right? We have lots of conversations in this country that are really about equality. But in the context of systemic violence, systemic discrimination, and oppression, it is hard to imagine how people who are theoretically here could end up being violently attacked in a society. And so if you think about this vis-a-vis Jews, especially the initial framework that I laid out, that Jews are effectively a white religious community in the way people see us, that means we are here. And if we are here, that means we are safe and secure. And that means anti-Semitism cannot be urgent because we are safe and secure and on top. And it also means that anti-Semitism can't be systemic, because how could a systemic bigotry allow a group to rise? That is the opposite of how we understand systemic bigotry. But the reality, unfortunately, is that anti-Semitism doesn't work that way. Anti-Semitism surges. It moves from the edges of society into the mainstream of society. And as that happens, the intensity of it rises, and the safety of Jews can rapidly decline. If I took us back 100 years ago to 1921 Europe, you might use the word privileged to define some Jews across the continent. Whatever country, be it the UK or Belgium or France, or yes, even inside of Germany, you would find Jews who were in positions of power or influence in civics and arts, in business, and yes, even inside of government. 20 years later, Jews across the entire continent were loaded onto cattle cars, shipped off to the slaughter, sent to the gas chambers and the ovens, forced to dig their own mass graves. Mass graves, by the way, we continue to find to this day. The unfortunate problem for all of us is that we think about the Holocaust as if it is a one-off aberration, when in fact, as I'm going to show you, it is just the worst example of a continuous pattern in Jewish history. So if I take us now to 2021, modern day America, you might once again use the word privileged to define some in our community. We are standing here looking backwards at this history, knowing how anti-Semitism has rapidly changed, worried that this steep decline could be part of our future here or frankly anywhere else on earth. Most people outside of our community think we're here, think that our line is going to be straight and secure. They don't see and understand this history and how this manifests. They take a look at the American experience, the last several decades in America, and they think that that is the rule for Jewish life on earth, when in fact it is the exception for Jewish life on earth today, and it is the exception for Jewish life on earth historically. We are standing here looking back at this pattern, and when we raise our voices, because many people see us here, they wonder what it is that we are so worried about. We are worried about this happening again, and as people dismiss those fears, it makes us more concerned that people won't actually see this until it is too late. So as we pivot to the next piece, which is anti-Semitism in action, which is going to show you a little bit of the history of anti-Semitism and what has happened to Jews throughout time and space, I want to say two or three things here. Number one, there's going to be some graphic images. I don't know how to do this without sharing some graphic images, so I apologize in advance, but I think it is necessary to help understand and explore this issue. Number two, we talk about this as if it's a virus. That's not a thing that I coined, but I do think it's a really important framework to think about, especially today, because all of us are acutely aware, and perhaps even our amateur epidemiologists, after living with a pandemic for 2 years, right? We now understand viruses in a totally different way. We know that you can be totally healthy and a virus can have no impact on you. We know that you can carry a virus and that you can transmit it without ever showing a symptom. We know that you can be immune to one variant and have another variant take you down. We know that if you're healthy, the virus may not touch you, but if you're not healthy, the virus can kill you. And we also know that when a society is unhealthy, the virus can spread rapidly and become a deadly pandemic. And the truth of the matter is, Jewish history is full of deadly anti-Jewish pandemics because the virus spreads. A new variant forms, and it's really important to think about the different ways anti-Semitism has shown up as a variant. New variants form, and they spread rapidly through societies, dramatically changing the safety of Jews in those societies. When many people think about anti-Semitism, they think that the death of Jesus and the Holocaust are the bookends, that anti-Semitism starts here and that it ends here. The reality is that it existed before the death of Jesus, or the blaming of the Jews for the death of Jesus, and unfortunately it has existed well after the Holocaust. Now, the death of Jesus is an incredibly important moment in the story of the Jewish people and anti-Semitism as well, because in the 4th century, the Roman Empire accepts Christianity as the official religion, which means it needs a new story to tell about the crucifixion of Jesus, and it begins to blame Jews for the murder of Jesus. that begins to set this idea in motion that carries wherever Christianity goes. And really, you can't understand the Western world, which says nothing about any other part of the world, but you can't understand the Western world without understanding the role of anti-Semitism and the story that emanates out of this issue in constructing the entire Western world, because it begins to ingrain into the DNA of society deeply anti-Jewish ideas. Because Judas turns his back on Jesus, Jews are labeled as disloyal. Because Judas gives up Jesus for money, Jews begin to be labeled as greedy and corrupt. And because Judas ends up killing or being responsible for, and the Jews are responsible for the murder of the Son of God or of God, Jews are labeled as a uniquely evil person, because only a satanic people would kill the Lord, would kill the Son of God, would kill the Christ. And that story begins to spread throughout the Western world and becomes a bedrock of our institutions and societies and thoughts. And if you've heard of a Jew, you have certainly heard some of those stereotypes about Jews as well. We talked about the Roman conquering of Jerusalem, but what we haven't touched on yet is the fact that Jews were burned at the stake for the plague across Europe. See, Jews have traditionally been scapegoated for whatever the ill of society, whatever the worst issue is in society, the Jew has been offered as a scapegoat and blamed for that. And that can be economic hardship, it can be war, it can be pestilence. Whatever it is, Jews have frequently been scapegoated for those problems, and that scapegoating ultimately has led to systemic acts of violence. In the late 15th century of the Spanish Inquisition, which is again a whitewashed way of saying the mass murder, torture, and expulsion of Jews across Spain. Throughout Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, Jews were forced to live in ghettos. This is a pretty benign picture. It's actually an artist rendering of the Jewish ghetto in Venice from above. These bridges could be enclosed and Jews could be restricted at any time from moving around. Jews were only allowed to live here, but were also confined here. And that was a truth of Jewish life throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. In fact, civil rights for Jews is something that is roughly 200 years at the most as part of Jewish history. Jews have been second-class citizens at best, basically everywhere we've lived over the last 2,000 years. Some places better than others, and systemically targeted at worst in these societies as well. Now, this type of violence wasn't isolated to Europe. In 1941, you had mobs in the streets of some countries throughout the Middle East or Southeast Asia, depending on how you label it. And this violence was taking place while Hitler and while the Nazis were executing their final solution. In fact, it's important to state that some political leaders in this region were supportive of the Nazis and agreed with the Nazis, and certainly did nothing to stop the mobs from seeking out and brutally murdering, beheading, raping Jews while this was also happening in Europe. In America, this violence has been part of our story as well. And I don't want to conflate the lynching of a Jewish man in the early 20th century with the systematic lynching of blacks across the South, but it's important to point out that this story is part of our history. Leo Frank was a Jew who was wrongfully convicted of murder. He was sentenced to death, but his death sentence was commuted. And in response, a mob broke into the jail, obviously was let in, and they took him out and they hung him. In 1939, again, while Hitler is rising and fully in power and beginning to round up and target Jews across Germany and the rest of Europe, in America, in Madison Square Garden, inside of the city that is home to the second largest Jewish population on earth, a full, open, proud Nazi rally. When we talk about the story of immigration or migration in America, we can't talk about that story without talking about the story of Jews either, because this energy inside of America, right, 70 years ago, essentially, 75, whatever years ago, essentially, led to the American government refusing to accept refugees from Europe. And in a very famous case, sending a boat back across the ocean and sending the Jews on that boat who came here seeking refuge to the concentration camps and to their deaths. Jews, as I mentioned, were the subject of legalized exclusion abroad, and that was also part of the case here. In fact, up until the middle of the 20th century, there was systemic legalized discrimination targeting Jews in many places in America. Jews weren't allowed to own land or have access to some public facilities. There were quotas on Jewish universities. So when I say that looking at the last 50 years of Jewish history in America is not representative of the Jewish experience, it's not even representative of the American Jewish experience historically, let alone the Jewish experience globally through the history of our community. And once again, unfortunately, we see this hate on the rise. That hate inevitably leads to violence, as it did with the Tree of Life shooting a little bit more than 3 years ago. But something happens when Jews are attacked, and this was a piece that was published in January of 2016 by an editor at Charlie Hebdo, asking why people didn't question when Jews were killed. And unfortunately, this question was all too prescient, because a year later, a kindergarten teacher named Sarah Halimi was brutally beaten, viciously stabbed, murdered, thrown off her balcony. And as the assailant threw her off the balcony, he yelled, "Allahu Akbar." The French courts refused to prosecute a murder or hate crime because he had marijuana in his system. And again, this is a worldwide problem. Wherever Jews have gone, this violence has followed us. The problem is not where Jews are. The problem is that Jews are there. And in fact, there are countries on this earth today where there are virtually no Jewish populations for whom the governments in those countries continue to blame Jews for the problems inside of those countries. And so it's really, really important, especially as we think about the way we think about things in America, to recognize and acknowledge the danger when people talk about or define the Jewish story or Jews as simply a white, privileged, and powerful religious community, because, as I've mentioned, skin color has never been determinative of our long-term security in a society. I'm about to tell you a slightly different story using some images on this screen. These images are going to look very, very benign because they are marks on a map. They are dots and triangles. Before I show you this sequence, every single mark on this map is an act of mass, coordinated murder and violence at Jews, targeting Jews. The dots include the intentional, coordinated, and complete expulsion of entire Jewish communities from where they lived, and the planned, coordinated mass murder of Jews in these communities. This is the 13th century in Europe, the 14th century in Europe, the 15th century in Europe, the 16th century in Europe, the 17th century in Europe, the 18th century. Put this all together. Again, every mark on this map is dead Jews, not just a handful of dead Jews. Every mark on this map is tied to systemic, coordinated violence, most of them, over 800 of them, acts of the total and complete expulsion of Jewish communities from across an entire continent. And this ends 120 years before the rise of the Nazis. When we talk about the Holocaust, we always start the Holocaust by looking at the rise of the Nazis. But what we ought to be doing is asking ourselves, what is it that seeded the ground for an entire continent to effectively turn its head as a power sought to demonize, slowly, intentionally, in a coordinated manner, first demonize and dehumanize, and then commit an act of genocide against Jews? And the answer to that question is that centuries of anti-Jewish ideas being tolerated, perpetuated, and spread enabled that to happen. I'm going to explain a little bit later how these dots on this map came to be. So where we presented as white across Europe, our whiteness did not protect us because we are Jews. And that's the problem. And unfortunately, that story is not isolated to Europe, although certainly the European story is probably the most extreme of our history. The reality is that this type of systemic discrimination and violence was part of our lives too in other parts of the world that we lived in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, depending on how you refer to it. So where we have been labeled as white, our whiteness has never saved us because the white supremacists do not believe that we are white, but rather that we are subverting the white race and that we are uniquely evil people, fundamentally responsible for the ills of society, and where we present as people of color, where we have been present sometimes for generations as part of societies. Our skin color didn't protect us either. Our presence in those communities didn't protect us either, because the problem at the end of the day is not the color of our skin, but that we are Jews. So as we shift to this final phase of the presentation, I want to focus finally on recognizing the signs of this mutating virus. How does anti-Semitism show up? What are the variants? And the way this is going to work is that I'm going to put a couple of big ideas on the screen, one or two big ideas on the screen, and then we'll show you what it sounds like so that you can start to identify those ideas when you hear it rhetorically, because the problem is that the rhetoric leads to the demonization and dehumanization of Jews. It enables the scapegoating of Jews, and eventually that is turned into mass acts of violence, especially as societies destabilize. Perhaps the most common one today is that the Jew is all-powerful, the idea that the Jew is secretly controlling governments and society. That also plays into the idea that the Jew can't be trusted, which goes all the way back to Judas and has been seeded for literally 2,000 years, that the Jew can't be trusted. And those two things combine into this narrative of Jews working to subvert communities. If you hear that the Jews control the media and the banks, this is what this is. If you hear the phrase the globalists, the deep states, or cabals, that is almost always tied at the end of the day to a story about Jews. Jews will not replace us. That has now become a famous line because of what happened in Charlottesville. The Jewish community in America is 6 million strong. That's basically 2% of America. We can't demographically replace anybody. The global Jewish population is 16 million people, which, by the way, is fewer Jews on earth than we had before the Holocaust. We have still not recouped our pre-Holocaust global population. There are 7.8 billion people on earth, which means that the Jewish population globally is a rounding error. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny rounding error. It's 0.002% or something like that. What this is saying is that Jews are working to undermine the white race in America, that we are the secret force behind the civil rights movement and the empowerment of communities of color, and we are the one responsible for the elevation of the so-called quote-unquote inferior races, because if white supremacists and white nationalists believe that black and brown people are inferior, then inferior people can't get rights unless there is some secret power behind that, and that is the Jews, which, by the way, is so critical to understanding that if you're concerned about white nationalism in America, you can't deal with white nationalism without dealing with anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is foundational to modern white nationalism. The Jew is also labeled as greedy and corrupt, and we talked about where that starts with Judas, but it accelerates in Europe, in the Middle Ages in particular, when Jews are prevented, systemically discriminated. Jews are prevented from owning land, and they're prevented from being part of many forms of work. But what Jews can do is be involved in trade, and because Christians are not allowed to be involved in money lending or usury, the European Christian rulers, who know that they need credit to keep their economies healthy, recruit Jews to be the bankers in their societies. Now, I showed you all those dots on the map, right? Those dots are human beings and communities being murdered and violently expelled. And the question is, how did that happen? And the simple story is this. Most of Christian Europe during this time period was agrarian, meaning lived on farms. But Jews couldn't own land, so they lived in cities. When weather patterns changed and crop yields diminished, if you are in an agrarian society, you live on a farm, that means you may not have money. And it also means you may not have food to feed your family, and you are certainly going to respond. And so who got offered as the scapegoat? It was the Jew. The elites needed to blame somebody, and they offered the Jew to the mobs, and the mobs were there to eat it up and take it right away because they had already been fed the idea for a long time, separate and before the role of Jews in banking and finance, that Jews were greedy, corrupt, and untrustworthy. And now, because those Jews were involved in banking and the money lending for these Christian European rulers, it led to an easy target because the Jews weren't as impacted by changes that impact farmers in an agrarian society. So it all was like, see, the Jews aren't hurt. It must be what they're doing. And that is what is a major part of the story of what led to all that violence. What does that sound like? Some of you may have heard the idea of Jew you down, or the phrase evil money, right? The idea that some money is good and some money is evil, or the corrupt elite, or the Jews are the 1%. Now, we talked about the way that the death of Jesus ends up starting this story that the Jew is uniquely evil and demonic. And that story accelerates in a very strange way in the late 12th and 11th and 12th century with the idea that Jews are killing Christian children to drink their blood. It's a really strange story, especially as I say it like in a modern context, but that story has survived and thrived. And before I pivot to the next piece of this puzzle, I'm going to stop the screen for a second, and I'll come back to the presentation in a second. But there's an element that I just want to sort of highlight before we pivot to the next piece of this puzzle tied to this issue. If any of us saw somebody in this country being directly attacked on the streets of this country, ostensibly because they're being blamed for the actions of another government, right? When Asian Americans were being attacked on the streets of America, all good-natured people spoke up and said that bigotry is unacceptable, even as we saw many people demonizing the Chinese government. But for some reason, when Jews in May of 2021 were being attacked on the streets of America and London and Europe because of the conflict, the war, the violence between Hamas and Israel, many of our peers and colleagues were silent, and in some cases even went so far as to say, well, but what about? And I bring that up because it's hard, it's impossible to take the next step in this story without recognizing the role that this idea plays, that it is so easy for people to be silent or question or think that question the attacking of Jews on the streets because of the actions, real or imagined, of a government. And it's so easy and palatable when it comes to Jews, and it would never be that easy or palatable when it came to anybody else in a similar situation inside of our society. And that is the latest variant of this virus, the demonization of Israel and the demonization of Jews who support its existence, which is not the criticism of Israeli policy. It is not talking about the actions of a government. It is something far more sinister that attempts to equate Israel and Nazis as an example, the Israeli flag and the swastika, because we all understand that the Nazis are uniquely evil. And when people equate these two things, what they're saying is this one state is a uniquely evil state on earth. And anybody who supports it, regardless of whatever caveats that support exists, meaning if you believe the state of Israel has a right to exist, regardless of anything else you may think, you are ultimately equal to a white supremacist Nazi upholding and supporting a Nazi regime. That is a dehumanizing framework that is leading to the targeting of Jews at home and abroad. And that sounds like the idea that Israel intentionally kills Palestinian children, that Israelis are Nazis, or that a Zionist is a racist. Most people don't know what this word means. To Jews, it is about a movement for national self-determination and liberation, a return to our ancestral homeland after the violence that we've experienced across the region, including in that land in our lifetimes. It's a 2,000-year-old yearning that gets its name in the late 19th century, which isn't to say that Zionism hasn't impacted the Palestinian community in a different way and doesn't mean something different to them. But the issue here is that by explicitly saying that people who believe in the right to or support the right of Jewish national self-determination on some portion of this land are akin to Nazi supporters, does nothing other than demonize and dehumanize Jews, and fundamentally not only erases our connection to the land, but our entire history as a people, and acts as if our trauma is irrelevant in these conversations. Which all brings us back to, as we wind down and move towards some Q&A, the question of how does anti-Semitism work, and specifically, how does this happen? How do these surges and spikes happen? And the answer is that Jews get cleaved from a society, which means that we get isolated from a society, that we get attacked from all angles, that we are mistrusted or demonized from all angles. What that looks like is the idea of a dominant culture attacking and blaming Jews. Jews will not replace us in this particular situation. Blaming Jews for the ills of society, blaming Jews for controlling the government and the banks, and the Jews are the reasons why all these bad things are happening in our lives. While at the same time, these ideas spread through marginalized communities. And so what you have is fertile ground where many communities and many people begin to absorb and accept the newest variants, because they've been preconditioned for centuries with these ideas, for 2,000 plus years with these ideas. And what ends up happening is that Jews end up isolated and alone in a society. And so as anti-Semitism is rising, and we raise our voices and our concerns, and as people respond either with a shrug or with silence or ask, what are you so concerned about? It leaves us to feel isolated and alone and worried whether or not it can happen here too, or whether or not it can happen again. We are worried about this happening again because it has happened over and over in our history. And too many view the last 50 years of Jewish life in America as the rule for Jewish life on earth, when in fact it is the exception to a 2,000-year-old story, which leads ultimately to the alienation and the question of whether or not we are alone. And too frequently in the history of the Jewish people, as a nation has become unstable, as the bonds of trust inside of that nation fracture, as catastrophic events weaken that nation, war, plague, pandemic, economic hardship, tear at the fabric of that society. Demagogues rise, and those demagogues offer scapegoats, easy solutions to complicated problems. And because these anti-Semitic ideas, these words, are allowed to travel so freely, are often unnoticed and unchecked in our communities, when they offer the Jew as the scapegoat, it has enabled throughout our history a sudden and rapid decline in the safety of Jews in that society. That doesn't mean that that is the story of American Jewry. And hopefully that is the story of our past and not the story of our future. But it needs to be said that that is what has happened. And that is why making sure that never again isn't just a slogan, but a mission to pursue requires all of us, Jews and non-Jews, to take that rhetoric seriously, to recognize that as it comes in from all sides, it can isolate and ostracize Jews, and it sets the foundation for the scapegoating of Jews and the potential systemic violence happening again. With that, Karen, we can stop the presentation and move to a discussion or question and answer.
Great. All right. Well, first of all, Oren, I have to say, it occurred to me that if we were not doing this in a virtual space, we would all be applauding you right now. So I'm applauding you for such a detailed and well-presented delivery. It's a big topic, and we just are really grateful for what you've just presented. And so I actually have a starting question, and I do want to make sure people know to put your questions in the Q&A box. We'd love to have your questions and not just mine. But I'm going to start with what appears to be a somewhat simple question, and it's not. Why is it so hard to define anti-Semitism?
I don't know that defining it is so hard, right? I mean, like, I think of it as like it's anti-Jewish, anti-prejudice and bigotry targeting Jews in its modern context for being Jews. I think what is so difficult is really that most people don't know what it means to be a Jew. They're confused, and understandably so. That's not like a I hate Jews problem. It's an understandable confusion thing. And so that means that you end up misdefining in a very understandable way what anti-Semitism is. And so as the first step, that's going to lead you in the wrong direction. And then the second piece of this is that the swastika, everybody gets. Right? Like either you are a Nazi and you agree with the Nazis, or like not, but everybody sees the swastika and they know. Almost everything else is a conspiracy theory. So the dog whistle is a thing that you and I as Jews may know, but the reason that a dog whistle is effective is that not everybody hears it, but the people you need to hear it hear. And so I think that makes it really complicated. And as we think in particular about, communities or friends that we are in partnership, relationship, or allyship with, oftentimes it's not that they support anti-Semitism. It's that they don't see it for the reasons that I just mentioned, right? That they don't know what it means to be a Jew necessarily, don't know what anti-Semitism is necessarily, and most people have not sat through a presentation like this to think about those variants and how they come up rhetorically, or to be able to see them or spot them. And then the last element, I think, is the piece that I said, which is understandably, especially as we think about America in particular, right? Like I don't use the word oppressed when I talk about the American Jewish experience. And as we're thinking about the broader challenges in our society, especially for, communities of color, marginalized communities here, if you look at our community, it's easy to quickly say, what are you guys concerned about? You guys are in great shape. And it's easy to dismiss that, especially vis-a-vis the other real urgent concerns that people rightfully have. And so I think that complicates things for reasons that are, I think, totally often innocent, but can have very bad impact.
So that leads me to a couple of other questions that but I wanted to make sure that I said that in the Q&A, that I'm sure you're not watching, Mona Kolko, who is the president of our federation, said not a question, but a standing ovation with several exclamation points. So I wanted you to know that.
Thank you.
So, you know what, I had my own question, but I'm going to go to the questions in the box because that's really for the folks here. So the first question I have here. The Christmas holiday season plays such an enormous role in the American calendar, cultural, economic, religious. Can you talk about how that affects negative attitudes towards Jews, even if unintended?
I mean, so can I say that it is rare that I get a new question. And this is a new question. So I don't know that I've ever actually spent meaningful time thinking about that.
Okay.
What I will say from a couple pieces of personal experience is, and this sort of gets to conversations about like inclusion of Jews inside of institutions,
right.
is I think for us, sometimes we feel unseen because we are a minority group, both religiously or demographically or whatever it is. And so I actually think the piece of the puzzle that's, I'm going to slightly pivot this a little bit, that's a little bit more concerning rhetorically on this issue than the Christmas thing. And I promise whoever asked that question, I'm going to think about that because I just haven't spent, and I don't want to make something up that I never think about, is in the last several decades, there has been a rhetorical push to say that America isn't a Christian nation or built on Christian values, but a Judeo-Christian nation. And in one sense, that can feel inclusive to us. But I think in the other sense, we have to be really careful about the fact that it is an intentional rhetorical concept designed to exclude a different religion, specifically to say that the Muslim religion is incompatible with America and with American values, which I obviously fundamentally reject. And I think that that's a little bit more of a challenge. And if you think about, and I don't want to get into a debate about or a conversation about like anti-Semitism on the left versus the right, we can explore that if there's a question. Right, like there's a lot of people who hold onto that idea, then push a bunch of anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes out there and say, but this is a Judeo-Christian country, I can't be anti-Semitic, da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I think that that's a little bit more complicated, and I promise to think about the other thing, especially as we are here. It's Christmas season.
Exactly. And what's so funny is this person had a follow-on question that said, is it acceptable for Jews to call the U.S. a Christian country? So it's interesting you touched on that whole Judeo-Christian idea.
Yeah, so I will, this sort of ties tangentially into the Israel piece of the puzzle, which is every country on earth is it's an ethnic nationalist country. Meaning, as much as America claims to be founded on core values, and we are fighting to try and actually have a diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country built on those values, there is a tug of war here that is far more about ethnic identity and the acceptance of an ethnic nationalist culture. And so, you know, at its core, I would say America is and has been founded as a Christian nation that I think in its truest spirit is trying not to be, but has been struggling with those impulses for, you know, a few hundred years. And we're continuing to be in that experiment of creating a country that's not based on skin color, religion, etc.
Right. Great. So this question, what are some ways to diminish anti-Semitism?
Yeah. So I think this is a good starting point, right? Which is, I'm going to use the shine a light framework, right? Is the more people who we can help understand three specific things: what it means to be a Jew, what anti-Semitism is, and how anti-Semitism works, the more effective we can be in stopping anti-Semitism, because it equips not just Jews who need to be equipped to be our own allies and advocates, but it equips our non-Jewish peers, our non-Jewish coworkers, our non-Jewish advocates to identify it inside of their communities when it happens. And oftentimes, it's not that they're tolerating it, it's that they don't see it for reasons that I think I've already explained. And so I think that those three particular things are really critical. By the way, I think that in order to do those three things, especially with non-Jews, you have to be in relationship with non-Jews, right? Like we have to have relationships beyond the borders of our community in order to do that effectively.
And I think I just want to add something that you said earlier in your presentation is, it's confusing what is a Jew, because as you pointed out, it's religion, it's culture, and so it's hard to get your arms entirely around it.
And by the way, I am certain that there are some Jews listening, watching today, whose primary Jewish identity is deeply ingrained in Judaism.
Right.
And that's like beautiful. And that's beautiful. And there's also some who are like totally detached from it. And that's also
right.
beautiful. And that's part of why it's so confusing.
Exactly. So here's the next question. Prejudice and bigotry are currently being expressed in very violent ways, with people expressing their objections becoming targets. How do you safely show your support?
So I am going to answer this question by disclosing to you that I wear a kippah in public at all times now, which is my way of telling you that I've made the decision.
And Oren, what's a kippah for people that don't know that word? Some people know yarmulke. Okay.
Yarmulke.
Yep.
For the layman's term, it's the little hat.
Right.
You can see on Jews from time to time. And part of it is a significance that we are recognizing that there's something above us, right? The Lord, and we're being respectful to the Lord. Mm-hmm. My decision to do that is actually not terribly based in religious frameworks. It's based in several things. Me, one, not wanting to show a sign of strength to us. Me not wanting to allow those who do hate us to run free, and letting them know that we're here and you're going to have to deal with us. And it's a sign of solidarity to those who don't have the luxury of hiding things that people hate about them. Even as I would say to other people, you have to recognize that many Jews choose to hide, from a nose job to hiding a Star of David to taking the mezuzah and marker off the door because of safety. I think it's important to recognize that part of the reasons Jews sometimes do choose to sort of blend in is because we're worried about physical violence, and we have reason for it, especially in Europe, by the way. So it's hard for me to tell any one individual, what do you do when you're worried about the potential of your public presence and public commentary leading to violence, because that's a really deeply personal question. Other than to say, I think each of us needs to do our best to find the strength that we can to engage in ways that we can, that we feel safe in doing so, while recognizing, I think that part of our burden is being willing to say, I know that there is risk, but if I am not willing to speak, that these risks actually increase collectively. And so when I think about anti-Semitism, the thing that I am worried about is not me being attacked on the street. And frankly, it's not me, a gunman walking into a shul. And that's not to say I'm not worried about those things. It's to say I think about the anti-Semitism at a systemic level. Meaning, how does the really bad stuff, the massive community-wide targeting of Jews, happen? That's the thing that I am trying to stop. And oftentimes, as I said, people want to ask me about left versus right. And frankly, I'm much more worried about a white nationalist gunman showing up at the shul and shooting up the shul than I am somebody who may identify on the far left who hates Israel attacking me violently or showing up at that shul. But what I recognize is that you can't stop individual acts of violence. There's nothing that we can do to stop individual acts of violence. My concern, the reason that I speak, is I am concerned about structural and societal violence, and that if we allow these ideas to spread and become mainstreamed, all of us as Jews, and by the way, many other people, because of what I said at the beginning, have risk. We assume, especially in the American context, that we're going to be safe and protected. And I hope that we are going to be safe and protected, and that the story of our past stays in the old world and in our past. But it's possible. And so I think that, again, never again needs to be a mission, not a catchphrase.
I'm going to jump around just a little bit. This question is, if the definition of minority is few, why are Jews not counted as a minority? And if we were designated a minority, would it make us safer?
It's a good question. So I don't know if this question is based on some like legalized framework or more like more as like a literal versus figurative. Jews are absolutely a minority because we're a minority, right? The math is the math. I think the space where I hear a little bit more debate is about the word marginalized. Are Jews a marginalized community? Which I think you can get into this conversation about the idea of how included into mainstream America in particular are Jews. And therefore you might have, I think, an interesting and real conversation or nuanced conversation about the application of the word marginalized. But that's not to say that there aren't examples of marginalization that targets Jews, be it in institutions or broader systems and societies. And certainly in the history of the Jewish people, marginalization is absolutely a word that we can use and should use because, again, the last 50 years of American history are like this, it's this against this. I do think it's important. So like that's why I said I never use the word oppression to define the American Jewish experience, especially the modern American Jewish experience. And I think it's important not to try to compare or like leverage language for the sake of leveraging language. But I do think it's fair and reasonable for us to sort of say, most of us are our collective situation is better than the collective situation of other minority or marginalized communities on the whole, which just says nothing about an individual in this country. But this country in the last 50 years is the exception to a global rule. It's the exception to the current rule. Jews in Europe hide regularly because of fear of their safety. And so if you feel like you have to hide for fear of safety, I would say that you're a marginalized community because your safety is not certain. Yeah.
And we know that certainly France, large numbers of Jews have left France to go to Israel because of that, as one example. This question says, I appreciate your connection of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. As a white Jew in the US, I like this a lot. I refer to myself as being off-white. I'm curious if you can identify specific institutional policies, practices, et cetera, that specifically target Jews. The person goes on to say, I get that it's not the only way oppression plays out. I think about this as coming from a family where my father left Germany at age 7 in 1936, so there were clear laws, et cetera.
Yeah. So let's start with laws, like legally in America today. I'm not aware of, and there might be, but I'm not aware of any active law that anyone's trying to enforce that is legally exclusionary targeting Jews.
Though I would just say, Oren, and I think you brought this up in your presentation, yes, and it wasn't that long ago that Jews experienced redlining, that Jews couldn't get into universities, et cetera. But to your point.
Yeah. I think it's really important to your point. It's like, we're talking about the last 50 years, right? Well into the middle of the 20th century, that statement would be different, and I could point to a whole bunch of things. So, that's a relatively new phenomenon, which is why I say you can't take the last 50 years to be equal to Jewish law. I think inside of institutions, there are some ways in which this is happening, even if inadvertently. I think the voices and concerns of Jews and issues around anti-Semitism are being excluded from broader conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Jewish community is not focused on representation or equity on these conversations, but inclusion and belonging. And because Jews get defined as both white and privileged and powerful in a religious community, it's largely Jews and anti-Semitism are largely off the table or not part of these DEI frameworks inside of institutions, be they corporate universities, schools, and that can lead inadvertently to things which may target Jews and can perpetuate anti-Semitism. I think that that's a legitimate concern and a thing that is actually happening. The other thing I just want to say to this individual is, the off-white thing I find is like a very funny way to say it, but I do hear a lot of Jews today, for reasons that I think are really understandable, saying that they're white Jews, or that the definition from the outside are you're a white Jew. the way that I identify is that I am a Jew who presents as white, or a Jew who benefits from white privilege. I recognize that I can hide and I have plenty to gain and have gained because of my skin color. But white supremacists don't think I'm white, and if they had their way, they would do something pretty specific with people like you and me. And I think that that's an important starting point to recognize I have privileges and benefits because of my skin color, but that at the end of the day, I'm a Jew. And what I've begun asking my friends, my non-Jewish friends, especially in the progressive spaces that I spend a lot of time in, is when you talk about me, either you need to do one of two things. Identify me as a Jew who passes as white, so that it's clear that I am a Jew, first and foremost, and that piece of my identity is actually the most important piece of my identity in the way that we're thinking about these issues, because as a matter of fact, it is. Or when you talk about white supremacy, be more specific. And I actually think, Karen, this is something that you introduced to me 5 or 6 or 7 months ago, which was the idea of white Christian supremacy, meaning Jews are not responsible for the creation of the Western world. If you think that we are, we have a totally different conversation about your perception of Jewish power. We talked about this earlier, that the Jew is all powerful and we have a problem to deal with. We're not responsible for the creation of the Western world. In fact, the most fundamental pillar to the Western world is anti-Semitism, is anti-Jewish bigotry. It's so foundational in the construction of the Western world for the reasons that I mentioned, that if you on the one hand say that I'm a white Jew, you end up erasing my Jewishness, while at the same time saying that white supremacy is the problem. You end up saying that you and I are fundamentally the problem.
Right.
And you have to do either or. And I'm okay with either or, which isn't to say what I think is real for our community, which is all of us would be better off, and all of us ought to, I think, explore the ways in which what we look like creates benefits and advantages in the society, and how things that we may be doing intentionally or otherwise may also be harming other communities. And I think that's an important part of our dialogues and conversations. So I'm with you on the basic idea of the off-white, because I have a similar conversation. That's less about how you identify me and more of a conversation of trying to help people better understand us and what you do unintentionally when you say you're a white Jew, Karen, and white supremacy is the problem. You just become a religious white person who is who is responsible for the creation of this world.
Right, right. Oren, I'm going to ask you permission to run over just a little bit, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Is that okay for you?
Okay. Yep.
Okay. And I'm going to ask the audience if they can stay with us, because we're not going to get to all the questions, but I actually would love for you to dig in a little bit more about what you talked about a moment ago regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Because I know that, in conversations you and I have had, this is work that you're starting to get more engaged with. And I wonder if you could just give a snapshot of what that work is looking like.
Yeah. So right now, largely with corporations, a little bit with universities as well, a little bit more corporate than university setting. But what that work looks like right now is sort of 3 steps. We are engaging DEI leaders, executives, committees inside of corporations and seeking to meet with them and provide some education not dissimilar to what we just showed, as a way to help ground them in who and what we are and what anti-Semitism is, with an ask of making sure that we are included as part of the tapestry that they focus on, not prioritize, just part of it. Right. Work then engaging and supporting the Jewish employees inside of that organization as well, as sort of part 2. And then part 3 is broader education for the members of that institution, be it one-off standalone work, like a presentation like this, be it something that's going to become more systemically ingrained into like the regular curriculum. And that's sort of the main piece. We're also working in some cases with providing ongoing support to DEI leaders inside of a corporation as they're thinking about how do they address these issues and incorporate these things. And we're doing some ongoing programming and workshops with Jews inside of these corporations or institutions who are looking for help in how to navigate these conversations with their peers, be it just general anti-Semitism in the workplace, anti-Semitism broadly, in some cases the conversation around Israel and Palestine, which can obviously become a particularly heated and loaded and difficult conversation very quickly.
Right.
So that's
great. So I wanted to just throw a couple quick things more at you. One is a follow-up question. It's interesting to what you just talked about. This person says, how do you respond on forms when you need to answer race or ethnicity? Because this person is saying, I don't feel white and Jewish isn't a choice. It's really odd. I never know what to say.
I usually select other if other is an option. And if not, I say prefer not to answer.
Okay. That's fair. So there's a lot more here, but I unfortunately, and one, there's a question about social media and whether or not anti-Semitism we're seeing more of it because of social media. Yeah. Right. Yes. I figured you could answer that like that quickly. There are other questions on here, but I really want to be honoring your time and everybody's time.
I can do 5 if everybody wants to stay around, and then I've got to go put baby Noah to bed. I have an almost 10-month-old son. My parents are babysitting because my wife is an ER doctor at work, who of course is excited about the latest variant. And so I need to put him to bed here. So let's do 5 more minutes.
Okay. All right.
I'll try to do 1 or 2 questions.
Perfect. And if people need to hop off, don't worry. We'll have this recorded. You can catch the very end. So this person is saying, how do we, what do we do about the moral equivalency around Israel? In other words, how do we reconcile the desire by the non-Jewish community to bring anti-Zionists who are anti-Semitic to meet with the Jewish community as equals?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a really interesting question. So number one, I fundamentally reject the notion, as I said before, that Jews should have to talk about this as the price of talking about anti-Semitism. And I fundamentally reject the notion. And I think that we should tell people that if we are coming to talk about anti-Semitism, the equivalent of that is not a counter meeting for Palestinians, which isn't to say don't bring Palestinian voices in. Please do. I think it's really important that people get exposed to all of this. And I am adamantly opposed to any effort to silence Palestinian voices in any way, shape, or form. It's to say those two things aren't the same thing. They're not equivalents. If what you say to me is, if you want to have a conversation about Israel, from your perspective, I also need to create space, then I would say, absolutely understandable, great, do that. And that would be my answer, is like, if we're going to talk about Israel, totally okay, because those two things are in some ways inverse, right? Like if you think about other communities that are trying to figure out how to engage, I'm totally comfortable with another institution who says, if we're going to have this conversation about Israel, it's also important for me to hear from other communities. Fine. I think that's perfect. The question is whether or not the price of entry for an anti-Semitism conversation is targeted on that, because that's problematic. That's saying, as a Jew, I can't elevate a bigotry against a Jew without giving platform or without confronting Israel and Palestine. And I think that that's a problem.
Right.
I want to add one more thing to this, because I think it's just important to broadly say to folks. Setting aside the fact that like anti-Zionism is a nuanced thing in a lot of people's heads and everybody has a slightly different definition, I think that somebody can arrive at the conclusion that Israel doesn't have the right to exist or shouldn't exist or whatever without hating a Jew. I think that there's a pathway there. So the problem itself for me is not necessarily, granted, I would say there's a whole lot of biases and blind spots on the road to that pathway. Meaning, like, how is it that only one group has this rule applied to it? Or you can't get there without some level of anti-Jewish biases and blind spots being part of your stepping stone to that equation, in my opinion. But the problem isn't the idea itself, meaning on an individual level, Karen, if you thought that Israel shouldn't be a Jewish state anymore, that's not exactly the problem. The problem is how it manifests in its next step, which is that the way it manifests politically is the demonization of anybody who disagrees with it. It's the Zionists are racist step. It's not a critique of ethnic nationalist states or ethnic nationalism or nation states in a political context. It is the weaponization. And that weaponization turns into demonization, and that demonization immediately leads to dehumanization, right? It erases Jewish history, intergenerational trauma, the Jewish story, how Jews ended up in diaspora, what happened when Jews lived in Europe, what happened when Jews lived in the Middle East and North Africa, in these other societies that people tell us to go back to. And it says the only reason that this entire thing happens is because Jews are racists. And everybody who supports these racist Jews in Israel are racist themselves, and these races don't belong inside of our community. That's the problem, because it manifests in a way that demonizes virtually the entire global Jewish community while masquerading as if it's not about Jews, while it is demonizing and dehumanizing Jews.
So the last thing is not a question. I have to share another comment, and this is from our CEO, Meredith Dragon, who says, I want to send a big thank you and echo Mona's praise. Oren's presentation should be seen by all. Thank you, thank you. This is exactly what we need right now. Your rational and important words. So that's a good note to go out on. I'm going to close, and I'm going to thank you first and foremost, Oren, for just a fantastic, expansive, incisive analysis. I want to thank everybody in our audience for being with us tonight, and certainly for staying over. I want to make sure to thank our steering committee, the Levine Center to End Hate Steering Committee, and our two co-chairs, Carolyn Nussbaum and Kevin Beckford. We certainly hope everybody found this presentation to be insightful and that you take what you've learned and share it with others. We are only as strong as our weakest link, and any form of hate ultimately affects all of us. So in order for you all to give us feedback, we have a brief survey that's going to pop up on your screen at the end. Please do take just 5 minutes. Let us know what you think of the presentation. Let us know what you're looking for in future programs. And we will continue to stay in touch, let you know what we have coming up on the horizon. And with that, I want to wish everybody a good evening and a happy 4th night of Hanukkah. And may the rest of your holiday be bright, light, and healthy. Take care. Have a good night.